Welcome, fans of Aquaman. My name is Sam.
My name is Rebecca.
And we are two members of the JLU podcast team who enjoy analyzing the DC films from Warner Brothers Studios. You can follow me at OttenSam on Twitter.
And you can follow me at Derby Kid, and you can follow the show at JLU Podcast.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about Scene 6 of Aquaman, which brings us into the present day after we've wrapped up all the prologue business. And we get to see the Kane family, this group of pirates that are going to be taking over a submarine. So the first thing, Rebecca, I wanted to mention about the scene was, a lot of people have talked about how the Aquaman movie here drew some story beats from Throne of Atlantis and some inspiration. It's definitely not what I would call an adaptation of Throne of Atlantis, but it has a few key elements that connect to Throne of Atlantis by Jeff Johns in the New 52. But one of the elements that definitely connects is this opening submarine sequence. In the Throne of Atlantis, there were Atlanteans taking over a submarine, and then, they have this surface dweller human submarine that they could repurpose and use it to kind of, raise some tensions. And here, it's a similar idea, but now we have the Atlanteans being even stealthier. They're actually, using a human to do their bidding and do their dirty work so that they're giving themselves even more plausible deniability about it.
Yeah, I would agree that there are some elements from Throne of Atlantis, not even just in this scene, but in, throughout the film. But I do like the idea that the Atlanteans are connected to the Mantas and how they deal with the surface world and people that they come into contact with. So I like the way it introduces Black Manta.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like that it directly ties Manta to Orm and his overall plot. So, Manta is not just a superficial side plot. He is actually part of the main plot, but then he has his own motivations and issue that he's going to be dealing with. So I actually think that works pretty well structurally in terms of plotting. And I also like that it makes sense for the Atlanteans to sort of, use a submarine and kind of pull that into their machinations that they're doing to rile up conflict with the surface world, because the submarines are sort of the best encapsulation of the humans sending stuff down into the ocean in a way that can be taken over and used and that sort of thing. So I think it just makes a lot of sense in terms of plot.
Yeah, this is the only way. A submarine is the only way that we can stay down there like that for long periods of time. So, yeah, I would agree that this is a good way to incorporate the human interaction under the water.
Mm-hmm. So the first element of the scene here is we kind of track behind what we're calling the Kane's submersible, pirate vehicle. And it kind of gives the silhouette of a manta, which is fitting. And I think we learn later on, there's like a news report or something that mentions it was a prototype submarine, vehicle that was stolen or something like that. But this comes into the scene and we follow it towards the more traditional looking sub. So what are some things that you noticed when you looked at that, Black Manta Kane vehicle that they're using to board the submarine?
Yeah, it's such a cool design. And I did not realize this might be something so silly. Maybe other people knew this, but I didn't. I've known about Black Manta for a long time, but I did not know that Black Manta could be based on the manta ray, which is an actual ocean creature. Mm-hmm. And so I in revisiting this scene, I learned a lot about the manta ray. So this ship, this submersible vehicle that we're talking about, it does have the appearance of a manta ray. So I think it's very appropriate that Black Manta and his father arrive on the submarine in that ship. And it even gives off some red lights that remind me of the look of the heat blasts that Black Manta's costume, his uniform, his technology, which is, I guess, Atlantean technology in the end, that gives off. It's that same kind of blast. So that it has that similar look to it throughout his characterization. So I really think that's really cool. And I was looking up manta rays because, again, I had no idea what they were. And I thought it was interesting. Of course, this is coming from Wikipedia, of course, the source of all wisdom and all knowledge. But Wikipedia mentioned that mantas were known as devilfish because of their horn-shaped fins, which are imagined to give them an evil appearance. Maybe that is why the creators of Black Manta created this character as a villain like that. But I just thought that was cool that James Wan incorporated the manta look into the character, because the manta ray, the creature in the ocean, actually is associated with
The villain
devil
of the
appearance.
ocean, kind of, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So I thought that was cool.
That's cool. Like, so I've known about Black Manta as a character for a long time. If you would have asked me, like, why is it Black Manta, I probably would have thought about it and be like, oh, maybe Manta Ray or something. But it was never on the forefront of my mind about the connections to Manta Ray until this movie. I feel like of anything I've read or seen or other incarnations, the animated, versions of Aquaman and Black Manta and stuff, this was the first time where they really leaned into it as a sort of design, choice, motif. And so the ship and the knife that he's going to get from his dad, and later on, this was the first time where I just feel like, oh, they're really leaning into that Manta side of it. And I like it. I think, it's a very comic book sort of thing to do, where you have a character and you're going to go ahead and just design a lot of things based on, whatever the costume or the name or style of the character. Yeah,
it makes me wonder what actual manta rays in the ocean think about this submersible. Like, do they get scared because there's a bigger one of them there? Like, are they freaked out about it? Do they follow it around? I don't know. So it makes me wonder what the actual ocean creatures think about this ship.
Yeah, that's a great question. Arthur would have to ask them to figure that out for us.
Yes.
So it moves towards and then kind of docks on the submarine. So the submarine is just, at this point, we don't see a lot from it. Later on, we find out, it gets to be in kind of bad shape when Orm tries to put it to use and stuff. But from what we see here, it just presents itself as a pretty typical kind of submarine. The docking is interesting. So, okay, what's this ship doing, there? And we go in, and so we don't see a real kind of human character when we get inside. We actually see like a machine gun or something like that firing first, and we see just like somebody that's taking over this submarine, but we don't know who it is or who any of these people are yet for a while. First, we sort of just see the impact of the violence of what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's a really great transition, because it goes from the landing of the Manta Ray ship onto the sub to the gun blasting inside. And it's a great contrast in sound, because when the Manta Ray attaches itself to the submarine, it's very quiet, it's very serene under the water. And then the gunshots of the entrance into the submarine are very loud and they're full of violence. So in terms of filmmaking and the cutting of that transition, I think is a really great contrast, because it really does shocks me when I watch it, because you don't expect that loud noise after you've come off something so quiet.
Yeah. I also really like that basically the takeover violence is already done. We see the gun blasting, but then as we pan around the inside of the sub, the takeover has just already happened, basically. And I like that they did that, because they're saving the action sequence for when Arthur arrives. Because if they did a sort of mini action sequence of the pirates, fighting and then finding that guy and then taking him out, and then eventually they have the whole submarine taken over, and then they tried to do a larger, cooler, better action scene when Arthur got there, you have sort of like competing action. I like it that they just bring us into the sub, we see what's going on, but we're going to save the fighting and the combat and all that energy, we're going to save it for Arthur.
That's a much better thought than what I was thinking, because I was thinking that they were trying to get away from showing violence, that they were maybe were skittish about showing violence, because movies like Man of Steel and Batman v Superman did not shy away from showing the horrifying consequences of violence. And so my thought was they were just showing that so you wouldn't actually have to get that in your face. But I like your idea, and I think it is a solid point that they would have competing action sequences there, and Arthur, Aquaman, should be the more important aspect of the action sequence on this sub.
Yeah. Eventually, as we pan around, we get to a character that does not have a helmet on. We can see who it is, and we eventually learn that this is the father, of the Kane father, so not David Kane, but his dad. So he stands out right away because he has his helmet off. He's a human. We can see his face.
Yeah, and what I love about this introduction is not only do we get introduced to Black Manta's father, Papa Kane, maybe you could call him, but
Jesse Kane, I guess technically, but yeah,
sure. I will call him henceforth Papa Kane. But I like that we get the entrance to him first, but then the more important introduction is to Black Manta, and I really love how the camera takes its time to get there to that reveal, because I'm of the opinion, and I think my favorite filmmakers are the ones who take character reveals seriously. When you first meet a character, it should be a big moment. It should be important to the viewer. It should make you sit up and pay attention. And I think what they did with Black Manta here was awesome, because it's a full pan that goes around the room, and like you mentioned, it shows the dead bodies on the floor, which is indicative of a villain, showing that a villain has come into it. And it ends with it keeps panning and panning and panning, and it goes past his father, and it gets to the point where it stops and pushes into Black Manta, and that's a big moment, because there's the villainous musical cue that pops in there, and so it just makes that such a big moment that he is the most important person in the room at that moment. And so I think that's really cool. And it actually, when I was looking at it again and noticing the smoke and how the dead bodies were on the floor, and his entrance in with the black mask that looks like it has, a breathing apparatus, I thought that was very Darth Vader in Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. And I don't know if that was an influence for James Wan, but it was very similar to that entrance for the first appearance of Darth Vader in Star Wars mythology. So I thought that was kind of a cool way to give him a big villainous character entrance. Yeah.
I completely agree about the emphasis on the moment and the weight of the moment of meeting him. So we're going to take note. We're going to really pay attention to him. And I also agree about the Darth Vader connections, because I thought the same thing when I saw this, because it's the enclosed space. It's this, the steam and stuff blowing out. It's also the, helmeted, minions on the sides, kind of like Darth Vader had the stormtroopers. But then this, the music and the emphasis on this main character, bad guy, in the middle, I think is definitely a Darth Vader type of vibe. I would wager that it was probably intentional to some regard, because to me it seems pretty clear, and it's also emphasized by the father who we saw and how he kind of looks and turns. So he's the father. We kind of get this sense from the body language that, like, I'm not the alpha villain here. I'm looking over here towards my son, who is taking off his helmet, and he's really the alpha villain.
Yeah, he even doesn't he make mention of that this is your reputation, this is your thing, this is what
it's your victory.
You're the one people are. Yeah, you're the one who people are afraid of and who are going to listen to you. Kind of a vibe that he talks to him about. So I think that is. Very interesting that that Papa Kane is very, much letting him take the lead.
Yeah. Now, I noticed also right away on first viewing that both villains, Kane here and then Orm later, they pull their helmet off and the camera kind of pushes in on their face, and then they lift their face up. I think it's a pretty similar shot in both. So you could look at that and say, oh, that's a negative thing. James Wan did the same sort of effect for both of the villains' entrances. Or I think you could look at the same thing and say it's a positive. You could say that's kind of a cool motif for the villains, that they both pull a helmet off and lift their eyes up and the camera pushes in on them as their entrance. So I choose to look at that as just a nice kind of hallmark and creative choice by the director, that's how I want to introduce my villains in a coherent way, across the movie.
Yeah, I think that's a visual motif, and I think that's a cool way to introduce similar type characters who are supposed to be the villains to the hero in the film. Mm-hmm.
So the next main beat of the scene here is they kind of push over a captain or an officer or something from the sub, and said that he did get out on I think it was something like there was a warning beacon or whatever, a trouble beacon that was on temporarily, but they shut it off. But that means somebody might be coming to help out, that sort of thing. But really the reason this guy's brought in is not for that exposition or whatever. It's to basically let us see David Kane here and how he's going to handle the situation.
Yeah, he is ruthless right off the bat. He doesn't even really, he makes a quippy joke to the guy, but he stabs him right off the bat murders the guy. And so I think you might, at least I did, got the sense that this guy meant business when he first showed up looking like Darth Vader. But seeing him kill someone shows that he means business, that he's not goofing around, that he is here on a mission, and that he is somebody we need to be afraid of. So I think that that's a good writing choice because, villains should be scary. Villains should make us concerned for the hero and for what's going to happen within the film, and within the story. And it's got to get us to the point where we are going to cheer on the hero to defeat the villain. So I think that's a strong character choice to make with him to get us to be scared of him right out of the gate.
Yeah, and it was a very ruthless move because that guy is, he's captured, he's detained, he's not an active threat in any way. He could have been used for leverage or something like that, or as a hostage. And just right away, David Kane's like, nope, I'm just going to kill him right here. So yeah, it's very cold-blooded. And I think with Black Manta, he can be a villain that's basically one where we just see him as a pretty bad guy from the start. We can have a little bit of sympathy for him when he loses his father, but we can still realize that overall he is a bad guy. We can root against him and that sort of thing. And then I think it leaves room for Orm to be a little bit more of a complicated villain because he's the main villain. But for Black Manta, I think it makes sense to have him as pretty much a bad guy who, sure, his dad dies, but he's a bad guy overall.
Yeah, you can definitely still have one villain sort of redeem himself, but also have the other villain maintain his villain status. I think that's fine. And I think that action that he takes against the captain to kill him, we've talked on Justice League Universe podcast about how mercy plays into this film and how different characters might show mercy while some other characters don't. And I think this is a great example for Black Manta that's showing that he did not have mercy on that captain. Like you mentioned, he could have just imprisoned him. He could have tied him up, but he didn't do that. He chose to kill him and stab him right after he met him, basically. So it's an interesting look into Black Manta because he does not show mercy to this captain, but then he wants mercy from Arthur later to help save his father. So I think that element of the film playing into those themes that we've talked about here on this podcast is very fascinating for the character. Yeah,
I think that's a great point. So the next major element here, there's really two more beats that are going to happen. One is going to be the father-son dynamic. We get a little bit of insight into their relationship and stuff. And then the last beat will be something is coming, and turns out, something hits the submarine. But first, let's go to the father-son moment. So we get a little bit of the background, like you said, about how Jesse Kane, the father, will admit, this is really, your triumph. You deserved credit for this. And then we get a little bit of all of a sudden, a little bit of a family history and that sort of thing. I know one of our teammates on the JLU podcast here is Alessandro, and he said he thinks it's a little odd when you're, taking over a ship and have dead bodies around you and somebody might be coming because there was a, signal that was sent out. Alessandro thought it was a bit weird to stop and talk about your several generations ago and that sort of thing. I will admit, the first time I saw the movie, I just took it in stride. I didn't really think about it to that extent. I was just, kind of following the movie as it was presented to me. Alessandro is probably right, technically, because of that warning signal that had been sent out, or the emergency beacon. But I also think this movie was being very efficient in the information that they wanted to convey and how quickly they wanted to move the plot forward. So they didn't want to have another separate scene with these two. They wanted to say, we just need to fit everything into this quick submarine scene. We're going to get anything that's needed, pack it in there. So I think that was just sort of a efficiency decision to do that.
Yeah, I can understand that criticism because it is a little strange. Aren't they pirates? Aren't they supposed to be coming in and taking over this ship? And I don't know, trying to figure out how to take it over. But here they are just having a heart-to-heart talk and having this big family moment. It does seem a little strange. The only way I will justify it is that there were other people in their crew who had come down there with them. So maybe whatever business they had to take care of, they left it to the underlings to handle. And maybe that gave them a few minutes that they could talk between themselves.
Yeah.
So I'll I'll give them a little leeway here, but I do agree. It is, when you think about it, it's a little silly.
Yeah. Now, if we just go with it and we just assume, like they say, that they've never shared this story before, like David Kane knows that this is like your prized possession, this is your favorite knife or whatever, and then Jesse Kane Papa says, oh yeah, I've never told you the story, this was your grandfather's. It's also a little odd that he's never told him that story before if it's like his cherished possession that David is aware of, that it's his cherished possession. But again, if we just go with it, they're fitting in a little bit of backstory, a little bit of exposition here about these two. So we find out the grandfather was in the Navy during World War II, and they called him Manta, and so this blade has like a manta etched on it. So that gives, again, like the nice manta connection that we were talking about before.
I think that knife is pretty slick. Like, that's pretty cool to have that design on that old knife like that. So I think it's, if for all the kind of silliness of having this talk right here, right now, I like that we get to see it. I think that's really neat the way they've designed that. But the passing on the knife is a big deal because it plays into the idea of legacy that we've talked about with other DCEU films, especially Wonder Woman, that played in very heavily with Steve Trevor and his father and Antiope and Diana. So it's neat to see that carry on in another DCEU film, to have those things be passed down. One of the things I thought was especially cool about the mention of the Frogmen, because I learned a little bit of history. So it's mentioned by the film that Manta's grandfather was one of the Navy's first Frogmen during World War II. And that he, like you said, was nicknamed Manta for his underwater stealth capabilities. And I thought it was neat because I did not know much about the Frogmen. I had never heard about that until Aquaman. So someone did their research when they were making this film. Apparently, the Frogmen were recon swimmers whose efforts would lead to today's Navy SEALs. They jumped out of small boats while wearing just shorts, snorkels, swim masks, and fins. Like, they did not have a lot of gear that we would associate with these kinds of swimmers and divers today. They had very limited stuff, but that was a big deal back in those days. But from there, their whole purpose was they swam along enemy beaches and made mental notes. They did kind of reconnaissance of anywhere they saw natural and man-made obstacles that could hinder a landing. So it was basically, they were doing reconnaissance for beach landings, like they had to do in those days. So they served in underwater demolition teams, is basically what the Frogmen did. A neat historical connection that they brought into this film and connected that to Manta, because then that also played into the legacy of him sort of being in the water, but also being part of the surface world, having dealt with the beaches, but also being part of the ocean. So I really like that idea that the Mantas are connected to the Frogmen.
That is really cool. Yeah, I figured there must have been some sort of historical connection, but I didn't know what it was, and I can always count on you to look that kind of stuff up, so I really appreciate that. That is really interesting to think about. It was also making me think about the connection between like Atlantis versus the surface world and some of the contrasts there. Like, so one thing that I had thought about before was that the knife, which I agree is like a really cool design, and I like it throughout the movie, but it does contrast with Manta's later technology that he gets from Atlanteans. So it's like, okay, I have this knife, which is a very rudimentary sort of tool, but is handed down from his, ancestors on the surface side of things. But then later, Manta also adopts these, laser, coming out of his eyes from completely Atlantean technology. And so I just like kind of thinking about that juxtaposition of the traditional surface weapon with like the very technological Atlantean weapon in the person of Black Manta. I also had not noticed this before or thought about it before, but in the story, Papa Kane says that the grandfather, after the war, his country forgot about him. And so then he had to go scavenge and just like try to survive, which now I'm realizing that is not just a throwaway line. It is explicitly said in this movie that Atlantis never forgets. Atlantis will never forget, never forgive, but they specifically even say will never forget. But then here, Kane is saying his country forgot him after the war. So it's kind of like an indictment of the surface world that we don't always remember the people who we have responsibilities for or the people who have done things for us and that sort of thing. So that's another contrast between the surface and Atlantis.
I like that a lot because it almost seems to me that Black Manta identifies more and wants to spend more time in the water and be part of what's going on in the water more than he does the surface world. So I like the idea that because of his history with his grandfather and the way his family had to survive, maybe they connected more to the ocean and to the water. So that in some ways ties him to Arthur a little bit, that he's split between two worlds, but often spends most of his time in the water.
Yeah, that's nice. We'll have to trace that a little bit more when we have later scenes with Black Manta and stuff too. The last beat in the scene is one I alluded to, which is we see the submarine and we see something tracking toward it really quickly. We don't get a glimpse of what it is, but in a movie called Aquaman, we can probably make a guess about what it is. But I like this. This is what we're calling Scene 6, and I like that the end of Scene 6 here, it builds the anticipation for Arthur's arrival. So there's a lot of filmmaker work that's done here to get everybody on the edge of their seat and get pumped up for the action scene that's going to come next. So the whole thing about, did we hit something? No, something hit us. And then seeing it on the, the radar screen, sonar screen, and then saying, there's something out there. All of this is just, letting us get prepared for what's coming next in Scene 7. I also was excited that they have the Hitchcock dolly zoom, or you're a camera operator, so you probably know better than me about it, but like the thing where, the background kind of recedes away. So they use that to further emphasize this whole moment.
Yeah, I'm a huge Hitchcock fan, so I know about dolly zooms. And I think it's used in good effect here because it's used with Manta and his first encounter with Aquaman. Mm-hmm. And so I think that what I'm sort of interpreting with the dolly zoom, because with the dolly zoom, usually it's used to create a vertigo effect, sort of a kind of chaos, when you're trying to communicate chaos or being broken from reality. Or what I think is the purpose here is that there's a realization that this character Manta is having, and it's his first encounter with Aquaman, knowing that Aquaman is coming to get them, and maybe it's trying to communicate anger, maybe it's just trying to emphasize that this is a big deal, that they're going to meet for the first time. So I think the dolly zoom, not only is it a cool Hitchcockian move, I think it does something for the character of Black Manta, that this is a big moment, that it's trying to convey something about what he's realizing about the fact that Aquaman is coming to them, is going to, they are going to have an encounter with him. So I think that makes the moment so much more important.
Mm-hmm. And all that setup pays off because their interaction is going to be very profound, and it's going to be something that completely changes, their relationship forever, forward. So it's not just like they overemphasize the anticipation here. It's like, no, this anticipation is all earned later when the stuff that unfolds in Scene 7 actually happens. So it is as important as it seems like it's going to be. So, yeah, and the other thing that I wanted to probably the last thing I had about this scene was we feel Arthur kind of arriving, and then we see him kind of like his back as in his shoulder as he's like pushing the sub up. And we get a really pretty shot of him as he's like pushing the submarine upward. But I like that it's before we really see his face or anything like that, we get just a raw sense of his strength and his power in the water. So I like that they sort of, have him arriving and everybody's kind of taking note of who is this that's coming, and we see his power, and then we see his face and get to sort of see a full action sequence with him.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me, this may be a stretch, but the anticipation that the Wonder Woman film built with revealing Wonder Woman's costume. They kind of showed it little by little. You only really got to see maybe a little bit of the boot, maybe a little bit of the crown, but most of the time it was covered up by Diana's robe or cloak that she had on. So I think that the way that they built the anticipation by just showing little bits of him doing certain things and little bits of what he looked like and little bits of his movements and how he could leap out of the water. I do think that is a good way to build that anticipation, because of character reveals are really important. So this big first reveal of Aquaman showing up on the sub, this big heroic moment for him to save all these people and fight Black Manta and have this big scene with him, that's important. So I think that it's a good choice to have that anticipation build like that.
Yeah, and with David Kane kind of marking the moment as saying that's not a man will also be part of this character of Arthur Curry. And, is he a man? Is he Atlantean? Is he surface? Is he the water? Is he both? How's he going to navigate that? Like, it's a comment saying he's not a man is a comment on his powers and supernatural kinds of thing, but it's also a comment on, if we take man to mean sort of like human surface dweller sort of thing. So, yeah, to me, it's scene 6 is overall a quite effective scene. If we overlook the fact that their full conversation and sharing of the knife might not have been completely realistic, but if we go with that part of it, I think it's a very effective scene for what it's trying to do in setting up the next scene and setting up the Black Manta character for the movie.
Yeah, I was surprised by how much I had to say about this scene when I was digging through it. So, yeah, I do think this is a good way to meet Arthur Curry down there on the sub.
And that is our analysis of Scene 6 from Aquaman. So next up, I think our very next episode, Rebecca, should be our Shazam review. So do you want to give anybody kind of a preview of your thoughts on that movie?
I really liked Shazam. I thought they did a really good job capturing the essence of Billy Batson and his family and what he has to go through and his personality. I thought that they did a really good job balancing the scary parts with the demons and the sins and mixed it in with the comedic elements, which I am kind of a snob about that kind of stuff. If it takes me out of a scene, I don't like it, but I thought that they did a really good job of that, and I thought they balanced the tone. The tone was very consistent throughout the film, and it told a good story and had a lot of character moments to it. So I thought Shazam was great.
Yeah, I also am pretty positive on it. I feel like it knew what it was doing. I thought it did it pretty effectively. I'm not sure if it's the kind of movie that needs a full scene-by-scene analysis. I think it's a movie that's sort of like, you can follow along the heart and the character and the humor of the movies, pretty easily, I think. But we are going to have an episode where we are going to unpack a few of the themes that we see in the movie and give our perspective on some of the characters and the kind of character growth they had. And one of the things I'm most excited about in our kind of analysis episode looking across Shazam is the contrast in motifs and symbolism and things between Savannah and Billy Batson and Shazam. I think they did a really nice job of drawing those across. Like, they both have a little childhood toy that they're going to carry on, but they're a very different type of toy. And I think that actually has meaning and was chosen very thoughtfully. So we'll get into some of that very quick, coming within the next couple days or so. And in the meantime, people can also check out our content on patreon.com/JLU podcast. There we have our Man of Steel analysis, which is very fun. I am very much enjoying that. And we have some other bonus content there as well. So yeah, lots of good stuff on patreon.com/JLU podcast. And thanks everyone for your support and for listening to this episode.